Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. Thank you. I'm Court Tan, the museum's Director of Annual Giving. It's my privilege to welcome a room full of museum members to this program. Your attendance at events like these is so important to making the museum a place of gathering for culture, creativity, and connection. Thank you for your membership support. Thanks to you, exhibitions like Frida Kahlo's Month in Paris allow us to create transformative experiences, inviting deeper connections with works of art and turning each visit into a lasting memory. And we have an exciting summer ahead for members. We are delighted to share what's ahead for you, including first access to exhibitions like Gustav Caillebotte and Elizabeth Catlett, along with the wonderful benefits you enjoy as members. One of my favorites is enjoying the terrace view of the city and spending time in the member bar on the third floor of the Modern Wing. In addition to complimentary coffee and tea, we've recently introduced a new menu, and with patio furniture being installed soon, it's the perfect place to enjoy a summer afternoon. Given the museum's singular Mary Reynolds Collection, this narrowly focused art historical exhibition could only have been realized at the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's not very often we get to see a double feature of not one, but two 20th century female artists. Caitlin Haskell serves as the Gary C. and Frances Comer Senior Curator in Modern and Contemporary Art and Director of Ray Johnson Collections and Research at the Art Institute of Chicago. She is an expert on the art criticism of the historical avant-gardes and joined the museum in 2018. Along with Tamar Castrovili and Olive Piliado, she is the curator of Frida Kahlo's Month in Paris, A Friendship with Mary Reynolds. Haskell's recent exhibitions and catalogs include, among others, Remedios Varo, Science Fictions, Cezanne, Ray Johnson, Care of, and Renee Magritte, The Fifth Season. Now, please join me in welcoming Caitlin Haskell.
Thank you, Court, for that really lovely introduction, and thank you all for sharing your Friday afternoon. Today, we'll have the fourth and final member talk on our exhibition, Frida Kahlo's Month in Paris, A Friendship with Mary Reynolds. Along with me, my wonderful co-curators, Tamar Kharatishvili, Tamar, raise your hand, and Olive Piliado have also given talks about this show. And in the weeks ahead, we're going to have three very accomplished scholars visiting us from Mexico City and Paris to take up specific threads within the exhibition. But today, it is my great pleasure to speak with you and offer some introductory remarks about the Art Institute's very first Frida Kahlo exhibition. So to give some very basic introductory context, our show looks at Kahlo's one and only trip to Europe in 1939. This was a moment when she was beginning to associate with surrealism, socially, if not aesthetically and ideologically, and it coincided with her rise as an artist in the public sphere. As you'll see both in my talk today and in our exhibition galleries, the story of Kahlo's time in Paris is one that the Art Institute is uniquely positioned to tell through our collections. And I thought I would start by going back to the inception of the project, when we were looking at Kahlo's letters from the winter of 1939, written to her lover, the photographer Nicholas Marais, which are held today in the Archives of American Art. This is one of two Kahlo love letters that you'll see in the vitrines in the exhibition. And at the bottom of the first page, so this is an 8-page letter Kahlo's writing on both sides, and I'm gonna be reading around here, and then it flips onto the verso of that page. Kahlo writes, 5 days ago, I left the hospital. I'm feeling much better, and I hope I will be entirely well in a few days. I didn't go back to the damn hotel because I couldn't stay all alone. Mary Reynolds, a marvelous American woman who lives with Marcel Duchamp, invited me to stay at her house, and I accepted gladly because she is a really nice person and doesn't have anything to do with the stinking artists of the group of Breton. She is very kind to me and takes care of me wonderfully. I feel rather weak after so many days of fever because the damn infection of the coli bacilli makes you feel rotten. The doctor tells me I must have eaten something which wasn't well cleaned, salad or raw fruits. I bet you my boots that in Breton's house was where I got the lousy coli bacilli. You don't have any idea of the dirt those people live in and the kind of food they eat. It's something incredible. I've never seen anything like it before in my damn life. So, reading that, I remember feeling that I had been thrust into the middle of an incredible story. I wanted to know who all of the characters were, and I also had a number of questions. So, who was the recipient of this letter? Why was Kahlo writing in English? Why was she so furious with André Breton? And we began answering those questions. So Kahlo was writing to Nicholas Marais, who took this photograph of her shortly before she set sail to Paris. And they wrote to each other in English because Marais was Hungarian-American, and English was the language that they shared. So Marais was an extremely talented photographer. He was also an Olympic fencer, and it was just an incredibly charismatic and charming person. The next question, why was Kahlo so furious with Breton? Well, Breton had invited Kahlo to Paris to show her work, and the plans for this show were not materializing as anticipated, really to say the very least. Her paintings were stuck in customs, and there were many other miscues, including the fact that Kahlo had traveled to Paris thinking that she would have a solo exhibition, and it was only after she was there she realized that she would be part of a much larger thematic group show that Breton had concocted that would join her paintings with 19th century Mexican landscapes, folk art, Mexican toys, and the work of a couple other contemporaries. But Kahlo was furious about this, and also the gallery space had not been secured. And when Breton finally found a gallery space, one of the partners of this gallery, Renew École, was rather conservative and really, frankly, felt that Kahlo's paintings were too direct, unvarnished to be shown. So those were some of the reasons that Kahlo was furious with Breton. But something that we did know about was this marvelous American woman, Mary Reynolds. Mary Reynolds was an artist, an art collector. She was an expatriate who had settled in Paris in the 1920s, and her home became a vital meeting place of both the visual and literary avant-gardes in Paris. In 1955, since 1955, the Art Institute has held Mary Reynolds Collection, which is to say that Mary Reynolds' Surrealist Library, her art collection, her papers, and her work as an artist, as a bookbinder, those materials have resided at the Art Institute since the mid-50s. Today, the collections are spread out all over. So some are in library special collections, others are in the museum archives, in photography and media, prints and drawings, and modern and contemporary art. But it's all here. And knowing this, we realized that we had the potential to tell the story of Kahlo's time in Paris in a way that had never been done before, and with objects that actually had been the contents of the home where she had stayed. So that was a really wonderful realization. And because of this sort of finding this place where Kahlo's history and our institutional history came together, it inspired us to create this exhibition. So the show looks at the brief period of time that Kahlo spent at Mary Reynolds' home, which is February 22 to March 25, 1939. And from this very small node, a footnote of 20th century art history, we try to shed light on a very pivotal moment of avant-garde art making and cross-cultural exchange, both between the wars, during World War II, and afterwards. And one of our goals is to introduce Mary Reynolds, who is a fascinating figure. I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to work on Mary Reynolds in my career. And we wanted to, well, and I'll just say that looking at these are photographs that you'll see in the exhibition. When you walk in, they're immediately on the right, part of a group of 6 photographs of Reynolds by Man Ray. And they remind me of a description of Mary Reynolds from 1943, where she's described as statuesque, unmelodramatic, a seasoned traveler, and nobody's fool. And that's the person who I feel like I've come to know a little bit. When we look at Reynolds' practice as an artist, she, in 1929, began working as an avant-garde bookbinder. So in French, the term is reliure. And we begin the exhibition with this terrific example of her work and sort of showing a practice that was to begin with sort of a commercially available paperback book, which she would then disassemble and then transform into a unique object, sort of a deluxe singular book, which was intended for her library. Sometimes Reynolds would give these works to close friends or the authors, but most of the works were made for her home, where Kahlo stayed. So we're also attempting to look at Mary Reynolds and Frida Kahlo together as artists, as partners of artists, as women central to the Surrealist social group. And by looking at these two figures, our theory was that maybe it would help to reorient our understanding of surrealism. Where surrealism happened, when it happened, and by whom. Does this have to be a movement that is best defined by a manifesto written in 1924, or are there other ways to approach this movement through the people and the objects that they made? And we were extremely fortunate in working on this exhibition. We're working with many very generous lenders. There are about 100 artworks in the show, and everything that is a Kahlo work is a loan, either from a museum or a private collection in the US, Europe, or Mexico, and everything else is from Art Institute holdings. So it was a great opportunity to really mine the incredible collections that we have here. So with that, I'd like now to say a few words about how did Frida Kahlo end up in Paris? And that story really begins in 1938. So in the spring and summer of 38, André Breton came to Mexico to spend time with Diego Rivera and Trotsky. And you see a photograph of them by Manuel Alvarez Bravo in Mexico in 1938. It wasn't just Breton who traveled. It was also his wife, the artist Jacqueline Lamba, who became a great friend of Frida Kahlo. And while Breton was in Mexico, he saw Kahlo's work and was just floored by it. He thought that it was fantastic. He felt that Kahlo had realized in her paintings things that he had been envisioning for European surrealism, but artists there hadn't been able to do yet. And very quickly, he contacts his good friend, Julian Levy, in New York, who organizes the first exhibition of Kahlo's work in November of 1938. So our first gallery in the exhibition, I should say, is looking at Kahlo's sort of rise as an artist and also is trying to introduce her a little bit as an itinerant figure. So let's look at this terrific painting from SF MoMA, Frida and Diego Rivera from 1931. Kahlo writes in this little inscription up here in the bird's mouth that she paints this portrait in 1931 in the beautiful city of San Francisco, and she made a gift of it to Rivera's patron, who would become her patron, Albert Bender. Albert Bender is not a household name, but he was a very significant figure in bringing Mexican modern art to the United States. He was the person who devised a plan for Rivera to have his first mural commissions in the US. So Rivera made 2 frescoes in San Francisco, one at the Pacific Stock Exchange and the other at California School of Fine Arts, which became San Francisco Art Institute. And while Rivera was in San Francisco, Kahlo was there too. Of course, she's painting because she makes this picture. But at the time, she's really showing herself as, if you will, Mrs. Diego Rivera, right? He's holding the brushes, and she has these wonderfully petite slippers in comparison to the very towering figure of Rivera. So this painting, given to Albert Bender, becomes Kahlo's first work to enter a museum. Bender gave this work to San Francisco Museum of Art, which later becomes SF MoMA, in 1936. So even before Kahlo has her first show, she has a painting in a museum collection. So that's kind of crazy. It was something that we felt was worth exploring. So what you're looking at here is the brochure for Kahlo's first exhibition at Julian Levy, and you can see the dates, November 1st to 15th, the gallery location. You can also see that she's being introduced as Frida Kahlo, parenthetically Frida Rivera, and that she's showing 25 works. This show prompts the very first critical writing on Kahlo, and in the exhibition you'll see a spread from an issue of Vogue magazine where Bertram Wolfe discusses Kahlo. He repeats 2 very often quoted phrases now. One of them is Kahlo herself saying, "I never knew I was a surrealist till Andre Breton came to Mexico and told me I was." So there's a little bit of protest there. And also Breton's kind of famous assessment of Kahlo's painting as a ribbon tied around a bomb. And also you can see in the caption a self-portrait by Madame Diego Rivera, a recent painting by the wife of the famous Mexican painter. So you will really have to go back, yes, tons of misogyny and sexism here, but the point is that at this moment, Kahlo is not really an iconic figure yet, and Rivera is far better known. He has a much more significant place sort of in the public imagination than Kahlo does. So in our show, we, of course, have the San Francisco painting, but we also try to tell the story of the Julian Levy exhibition. This whole wall is really trying to unpack Kahlo being in New York. Not only does she send 25 of her paintings, she also travels there herself and spends a lot of time in the gallery. And from this checklist, you'll see in the exhibition that we have the painting The Frame, we have the painting Food from the Earth, and we have a work that is very closely related to Fu Longchang and myself. So this is The Frame, here Food from the Earth. So neither of these works sell from Levy's exhibition, which means that they're going to go right on to Paris, to Breton's show, after that project concludes. And then this is the painting that relates very closely to Fu Longchang and I. So this is a wonderful loan to our exhibition from the Albright Knox in Buffalo. And as you can see, it says it's a bequest of Concher Goodyear. So at the time of this show in November 38, Goodyear was a trustee of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. and he wanted to buy this painting, which was in Levy's show. And Kahlo said, unfortunately, it's not for sale. I've given this to one of my friends. It's not for sale to anybody. It's not for sale to a trustee of MoMA. But what she agreed to do was make sort of a reprisal of that painting. So she made this work in her New York hotel room and gave this to Goodyear. And it's, Fu Long Chong is, of course, seen here. This is Kahlo's pet spider monkey. And when I look at this wonderful green ribbon, which is also sort of echoed in the green thread in Kahlo's hair, that phrase of a ribbon around a bomb always comes to mind. And as I shared, Kahlo was in the gallery herself and was becoming a sensation. She has flowers in her hair. She is wearing very traditional clothing from the area of Tehuantepec. Her sister is also present, who is not wearing these sort of traditional clothing. She's wearing much more contemporary attire. But this is a photograph of Kahlo taken by Levy around the time of her exhibition. And also, we have Nicholas Marai, who's taking photographs of Kahlo at this time. And I'm pausing on these two prints that are included in the exhibition because they're very special, and I think they speak to the specificity of our checklist. These two prints, if you were to look on the verso, you'll see that Kahlo inscribed them to a recipient, Walter Pock. So one of the prints is given to Walter and his son Raymond, and the other is given to his wife Magda. And they're inscribed New York, December 1938. So this is just before Kahlo set sail to Paris. Walter Pock is a very significant figure because he is the individual who introduces Kahlo by letter to Marcel Duchamp. Pock has this letter of introduction where, and then he reports on this to Kahlo and says, if you run into any trouble with Breton, look to Marcel Duchamp. He'll appreciate your work. He speaks wonderful English, and he'll be able to help you. And that connects to our next gallery, where we have on loan from the Casa Azul in the United States for the very first time this address book, which Kahlo brought with her to Paris, and we have it opened up to the page where she's written down on D, Duchamp, 14 Rue LA. So Duchamp had a studio. He kept a studio at 14 Rue LA, but really this was the home of Mary Reynolds. And if you visit that street, it's in the 14th arrondissement today, you'll see a very wonderful marker acknowledging the fact that Reynolds was practicing as a bookbinder, that she was close to the Dada movement, and that she was also part of the French resistance. But this was not where Kahlo arrived originally. The idea was that she would stay in the home of Breton and Lambe in the Pigalle neighborhood. Kahlo made it there about 72 hours and decided she had had enough of that. And she checked herself into the Hotel Regina. And she writes this letter, the February 16th letter, from that hotel. And you can see that there's a return address, or an envelope with that return address in our show. The next thing that happens, and basically, at the point she leaves Breton's house, Kahlo is ready to call off the exhibition. She's truly furious, and it just thinks the whole idea of exhibiting her work and making this trip to Europe was totally ill-conceived. Diego Rivera convinces her that she should stay with her paintings because he's not convinced that they'll send her work back. As I was saying, it's stuck in customs. So she decides to stay. And ultimately, for the good, she gets sick. And that's what she's talking about in the first letter that I read. She ends up spending a couple of weeks in the American hospital in Paris. And it's, in fact, Mary Reynolds who says to her, "You're really sick. You need to go to the hospital." And she does. And then they begin a conversation about after the hospital, why don't you come and stay with me? And Mary Reynolds actually had 2 properties at various points in time on Rue LA. This one is number 14, and from time to time she also rented number 24 on this sort of cul-de-sac. And Tamar and I became obsessed with this house and finding out what happened inside, because there are no extant photographs of the interior of the home, but we know from, at least from the time when Mary Reynolds and Marcel Duchamp were there, but we know that it was a very public collaboration between Duchamp and Mary Reynolds, the way that it was decorated. And so we tried to find as many descriptions of the home as we could. There are about a dozen of them by figures like Peggy Guggenheim, Man Ray, H.P. Roche, others who had been in this house. And we know, for example, that it had very distinctive green wallpaper covering. So that's where we get the green in the second room of the exhibition. We know that there were many Alexander Calder mobiles hanging both inside the home and outdoors in the garden. And while there aren't photographs of the interior, an artist by the name of Jean Souquet visited the house late in Mary Reynolds' life, and he made this very handy sort of floor plan from memory where you can see, you enter here, there's a little garden. This is the space where Duchamp had his studio. We know from these descriptions that Duchamp decided to basically wallpaper his studio with Michelin maps of France at inconsistent junctures. So it was all sort of imaginary pathways, but with the lines intersecting. Along this staircase here, in addition to having Calder mobiles, there were also pieces of colored glass hanging by string. We know that around the rooms, Reynolds, who was a great fan of dangly earrings, she would have her earrings hanging in pairs, sort of sparkling on the wall. And then we have this beautiful garden where entertaining would also take place. But this was sort of the primary entertaining space, and you can see that Souquet draws a very large table there. And that's why we have a large table in our exhibition, sort of giving a sense of community coming together at Mary Reynolds' home. And on any given night, you could find people like Brancusi, Man Ray, Duchamp sitting around the table at Mary Reynolds' house, also authors, Jean Cocteau, spending time there. And it was important to us to be able to sort of create this setting with the artworks that were on view in that space, but that also become something of a group portrait of the artistic community that Kahlo was entering into. And what's also nice when you're in the exhibition, or I feel that it's nice, is that for the works that are presented on the table, you can really see them in the round, and the books start to feel like the sculptural objects they are. They're not just something that would have been on a shelf. So I'm going to move now into some of Mary Reynolds' practice. And Mary was a great collaborator. She worked often with Duchamp, and we're showing here the example of the green box in Mary Reynolds' collection. When you see this in the exhibition, you can also look at it from the other side, and from that vantage, these perforated letters are also visible, and Duchamp writes out for Mary Reynolds, inscribing this as a dedication to her. It's a very special example of the green box. You can also see that when Reynolds was creating book bindings, she used this visual language as well, although the dots here are now additive, spelling out the title Shen Asia and making a beautiful sort of right angle going down the cover of the book. Duchamp and Reynolds also collaborated on several books. So this is a book of Duchamp writings, sort of aphorisms, known as Eros c'est la vie. And here we're featuring the wonderful end papers that Mary Reynolds has designed with the ferns and then these oversized insects rendered in pochoir, which I especially love. We've also tried to create conversations between and among the books and the artworks that would have been hanging on the wall, such as this fantastic and very rare Suzanne Duchamp watercolor. So this is Duchamp's sister's artwork, and it's very infrequently shown, but terrific. And you can see that it has an inscription to Mary Reynolds there, so a very personal gift to her. This is something that would have been known to have been in her home. The same way with the Yves Tanguy. This is a beautiful panorama, and if you're going to really have to squint your eyes to see it, but there is an inscription to Mary Reynolds too. If you've visited the Casa Azul, Frida Kahlo has basically the companion piece to this, a very similar Tanguy, also in this panoramic format, same scale, with an inscription to her. There also were some surprising inclusions. So when we were researching what objects would have been in Mary Reynolds' home, often we have the clue of a credit line that says Mary Reynolds Collection or gift of Frank Hubacek, who was Mary's brother, who was a trustee of the Art Institute in the 50s. But there were other artworks that did not come to us through that bequest that we found out were present in the home. So this Brancusi, Two Penguins, was in Mary Reynolds' garden. And we know this because H.P. Roche talks about having dined on a wonderful roast chicken lunch one weekend and deciding to buy the remaining shares of Two Penguins while he and Duchamp were in conversation there. But probably the most surprising figure to see entering into Mary Reynolds' home was Frida Kahlo. And we choose to present La Venedita, the Wounded Deer, from 1946 here because it is an especially surrealistic self-portrait. It's the only self-portrait in which Kahlo merges her likeness with that of an animal. The sort of Saint Sebastian-like deer being struck by the arrows is an indication of great physical pain that Kahlo had in the 40s. Of course, she experienced a great deal of physical pain throughout her life, but specifically in the 40s, she was having a number of back surgeries. There's a second painting from this moment that we'll talk about a little bit more. But it also seems to relate to Nick Marai, who photographed Kahlo with her pet deer, a beloved pet deer named Granizo. So it's sort of tying back to Marai as the recipient of the letters that are in the adjacent vitrines. When Mary Reynolds was collaborating with the people who were her friends and spending a lot of time in her home, her style shifts a lot, right? So if you're looking at the Kahlos in the exhibition, there's great consistency in how the paint is applied, and they all look like one cohesive body of work. Reynolds was very adaptable, and often she would try to evoke something of the literary or visual style of the artist with whom she was working. So here Jean Cocteau has in the copy of Désert that Mary Reynolds has bound, makes this wonderful profile drawing, signs it Jean, and with his symbol of the star. But we've also tried to sort of bring in the voice of some of these collaborators like Cocteau, who says in this book, poets don't draw, they untie handwriting and then knot it up again in a different way. And we see that style of mark making in the Jean Cocteau drawing, Maison de Santé, which has a very sort of linear thread-like quality to it. So when Mary Reynolds creates a unique binding for Maison de Santé, she incorporates not only Cocteau's star motif, but also actual physical threads running their way through that cover. Another example, this is one of the last bindings that Mary Reynolds worked on. It's Raymond Queneau, Saint-Glinglin. And Reynolds has incorporated this shard of pottery. It's actually a teacup handle that has been affixed to the spine. So it's fun to, I wouldn't recommend doing this, but it's fun to imagine sort of taking that off the shelf. But you might be saying, why why is there a broken teacup? Well, in the story, Zostriel, one of the protagonists, raises his golf club and with a single vigorous blow smashed at least 203 plates. So an idea from this story has been manifest in a physical way on the exterior of Mary's work. And again, another great keno, this is one of my favorites, for Un rude hiver, a hard winter, this quote, "It had never been so cold outside," with a thermometer running up and down the spine there as a wonderful surrealist object. And several visitors to the exhibition have pointed out that Duchamp also used thermometers in some of his works, including the artwork that's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art called "Why Not Sneeze, Eros c'est la vie." And then again in this Saint-Exupéry, Night Flight, the quotation, "Tonight with my 2 airmails on their way, I am responsible for all the sky." For this work on the end papers, Mary Reynolds has incorporated Duchamp roto-relief designs there. So highly sort of collaborative works, and my hope is that when you're in the second gallery, you have a sense of Mary in conversation with lots of people, and that you can envision Kahlo for this very brief moment embracing life within the Paris avant-garde for a few weeks. This would not last for a very long time. It was a brief moment when she was there, and we take up this idea in the third and final gallery of the exhibition. The space of the third gallery is divided into 2 halves, one looking at the exhibition Mexique, and the other looking at what we call sort of post-Paris, what happens after Kahlo leaves. But while Kahlo is staying at 14 Rue Halley, she is preparing for the exhibition Mexique, and you can see this is the sort of announcement here, where, as I've talked about, pre-Columbian artworks, popular object, paintings, but also Frida Kahlo de Rivera, and photographs of Manuel Alvarez Bravo to be shown at Renew École. And ultimately, Kahlo was really quite happy with how this exhibition was pulled off. And we know that Kandinsky attended the opening, Miro attended the opening, Wolfgang Paulin and Elise Rayon, many figures who you will see in the International Modern Art Galleries on the 3rd floor of the Modern Wing were present in attendance to celebrate Kahlo at that moment. This is the catalog. Mary Reynolds had the catalog for Mexique in her collection, not surprisingly. On the cover, you can see this is an Alvarez Bravo photograph. And we try to give a sense of some of the other artists who were included in Mexique. So there were Posada broadsides, Alvarez Bravo photographs, and the one place in the exhibition where Rivera makes an appearance, Breton asked Rivera to create sort of an interior cover for his journal Minotaur while Mexique was on view. So you can see that. Very nice design there. But we have, as well, 2 of the artworks that were presented in Mexique. The frame is a fascinating artwork, and it's hard to read as an object, so I'll explain a little bit about the components. The red wooden painted frame and the reverse painted glass are elements that Kahlo bought in Mexico. They would have been made by an artisan. And you would have used a frame like that to make an ex voto. Kahlo has the ingenious idea to insert her own self-portrait into this framework. And so what you're seeing here, that is the bare aluminum support. So anything that kind of looks like it's shining back at you, that's what Kahlo is painting on. And then this area with the scalloped edge, everything there, that's what Kahlo painted, and then put her work within this folk object context. At the end of Mexique, this work was purchased by the French state, and it remains the only Kahlo in a public collection in Europe. So we're very grateful to the Centre Pompidou for lending this to us. And I also think that in the context of a show that includes Mary Reynolds and Marcel Duchamp, there's also sort of a sense of a ready-made element or an assisted ready-made element in Kahlo's practice. The still life, it's relatively rare to see a Kahlo still life. This is a work that we're borrowing from Banamex in Mexico City. This painting returned to Mexico, and we know that when it was in Mexico, Kahlo repainted it while it was in its frame. So when this was on view, and you're looking at the artwork out of its frame, you can see that it originally had a very bright sort of sunny sky. But after it was shown in 39, Kahlo repainted the sky while the work was in its frame, sort of signaling the tumultuous state of the world. Her relationship with Rivera was also rather tumultuous at this moment. And after our exhibition, we're going to do some pigment analysis to test the pigments that she's using and compare them to the pigments that are used in Las Dos Fridas, which is painted in 1939 and has a very similar stormy, cloudy sky. So just before the conclusion of Mexique, Kahlo leaves. She sails back across the Atlantic, stops in New York, and Mary Reynolds writes this letter to her, sort of talking about how much she misses having Kahlo in her home, and noting that with love and thanks that we had you with us even a little while. But there are some indications in this letter of the friendship that developed between Kahlo and Reynolds. So this note here about including Mickey, Mildred, Marcel, and me. Of course, we know Marcel Duchamp, but Mickey and Mildred are Mary Reynolds' cats. And also this candid note here about, it's going to take me a moment to find it, but she says, I far outdrank the Tanguys at dinner last night. So that's Yves Tanguy and Kay Sage. Tanguy was the person who installed Mexique, except for Kahlo's works, which were installed by Duchamp. Shortly after Kahlo returned to Mexico, a number of the members of the European Surrealist group also found themselves in Mexico because they were fleeing World War II. They also sort of did a reprisal of Mexique, if you will, in Mexico in January 1940, the International Exhibition of Surrealism, which, much like the Mexique catalog, has an Alvarez Bravo on the cover. But now we're starting to see a much more international and integrated surrealist group. So it's not just Kahlo showing paintings like Las Dos Fridas, but also Max Ernst, Salvador Dali, and Duchamp have their work included in this exhibition. What is Kahlo doing at this time? Well, as I mentioned, her relationship with Rivera was on the rocks. They divorce and then remarry in 1940. And in this work, which is, I think, one of my absolute favorites, they're all my favorites, but today this is my favorite, where Kahlo is, sporting the sort of close-cropped hairstyle that she would have seen in Paris, worn by people like Mary Reynolds. And her longer hair is, of course, strewn across the floor in a very dreamlike, surrealistic way. And she's wearing men's attire, sort of engaging some of the play with gender that the surrealist group in Europe was doing regularly. We also know that Kahlo was doing this as a young woman too. This is also the only place in the exhibition where we see Kahlo wearing European-style clothing, so performing in a different way. And in the inscription at the top, she's saying, "You used to love me for my hair. Will you still love me now that it's all gone?" So this is sort of directed to Rivera in a way, and or to her audiences who had come to love her looking in a very particular way. Duchamp was also thinking about needing to pick up and leave, and we represent that idea of sort of transatlantic movement in his Boîte en Valise. So these are miniature examples of Duchamp's life's work up to this moment, all contained in a box, then set within a Louis Vuitton suitcase. And you can see that this is the example specifically for Mary Reynolds. It is example 0 of 20 in Series A, the very first group of boîte à valise. So spend some time with this if you're a Duchamp fan. It's a really special thing that we have. And Duchamp, of course, does pick up and leave. He settles in the United States. Reynolds did not. Reynolds stayed behind, or at least not immediately. She stayed behind in her home at 14 Rue LA until the fall of 1942, and she worked as a member of the French Resistance. And I'm showing these covers of the New Yorker because when she did make it back to New York in 1943, after having crossed the Pyrenees on foot, the account of her escape was serialized in the New Yorker in May and June of 43. You can read this; it's incredible. And it's this. The title is "The Escape of Mrs. Jeffries," but Mrs. Jeffries is Mary Reynolds. Folks have been interested in the ways that Kahlo and Reynolds stayed in touch over the years. We include in the exhibition this Man Ray photograph of Mary Reynolds created by Man Ray. So it's quite similar to the works in that group of 6 that you see in the first gallery, but this is the photograph that Frida Kahlo had. This is a loan from the Casa Azul being lent for the first time. But there are also maybe some ways that we see in Kahlo's work her thinking back to these years around 1938 and 39. And I'll just very quickly sort of point out a similarity between this self-portrait in miniature, which we're borrowing from a private collection. This is Kahlo's smallest self-portrait, again, from around 38. But in this double self-portrait from 46, we see that same ribbon and the same collar of this dress with the interlocking gold and black triangles around the collar. So for us in the exhibition, it was important to be able to conclude with a double self-portrait of Kahlo, since we had opened with a double portrait of Kahlo and Rivera. But hopefully people are also seeing this connection to the miniature. And also a visitor asked me this yesterday. This is Kahlo too here. So she was in 46 having many excruciatingly painful back surgeries. And what she's showing herself is in this portrait holding the flag. The tree of hope remains strong. If you look closely at this, you'll see that she has tears in her eyes at this moment because of the agony that she was in. And this double self-portrait for me also evokes Las Dos Fridas, and knowing about the self-portrait in miniature, I now pay a lot of attention to what this Frida is holding in her hand. It is a miniature of Diego Rivera there. So we're about to wrap up, but kind of to conclude the Mary Reynolds side of our story, we tell this story right up to 1955, the moment when her collection comes to the Art Institute as a gift of her brother, Frank B. Hubacek. So really in late 45, just a few weeks after the Allies declare victory in Europe, Mary Reynolds returns to her home at 14 Rue LA. She just cannot wait to get back to this delicious activity of bookbinding, as she calls it. And she's very active again. She's also close with Alexander Calder, helping him prepare for his exhibition in Paris. And she was an editor of View magazine. But in 1950, she became very ill. And it was clear to Frank Hubacek that Reynolds would not recover from the illness that she had. And so he pays for Duchamp to be in Paris and to stay with Mary Reynolds in her last weeks. And Duchamp was there when Reynolds died, and just a few weeks before her 60th birthday. And together, Duchamp and Hubacek start thinking about what should happen to this home and what should happen to Mary Reynolds' practice as an artist. And thankfully, they decided to keep everything together so that we could actually sort of have a sense of Reynolds' agency as a collector, as a person whose home was this gathering place, for the Paris avant-garde. And they also So in deciding that her library, her art collection, and her books should come to the Art Institute, they decided that this, by keeping everything together and making this gift to a museum, it would be something to commemorate with a few new artist commissions. So that's what we're showing here in this tender homage to Mary Reynolds by Cocteau, this great drawing of Calder showing Mary Reynolds with her cats. And then this drawing here might look familiar to some of you who use the Ryerson Library regularly. This is Duchamp's drawing of Mary Reynolds in profile with her monogram as an earring, as if designed by Alexander Calder. And you can read in the inscription here that this will become the bookplate of Mary Reynolds' collection. And you can see this little rectangle there. They're saying, how will it look reduced to that size? And for all of us who use the library, that's something that we still get to see, which is really special and sort of connects the work that we're doing back to this wonderfully rich story of Mary Reynolds and the time that Frida Kahlo spent in her home in 1939. It has been a great joy for my co-curators and me to work on these two tough, strong, inspiring artists. And it's a great pleasure for us to be able to share this story with you in our galleries. The exhibition will be on view until July 13th. It doesn't travel anywhere else. You have to see it here. So please, I hope you've had a chance to enjoy it yourself. Invite your friends to come too. And if you have any questions, we have about 5 minutes, and I'd be happy to take them. Thank you.